Hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and today I get to have good conversation with some people who've done more than maybe most people to help save the world. We talk about it, but these guys are really into it. And these are youngish people who have been working still in the last almost decade on attempting to put through a, a treaty that would ban the existence even of nuclear weapons on the planet, which is a daunting and amazing thing to even attempt. But by golly, they got there. So Tim Wright, who's in Melbourne, Australia, as we speak, he's been on the staff of ICAN, ICAN, an international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. Okay, and here's Erin Hunt, who's closer to me. She's only in Ottawa, and she's with Minds Action Canada. Hi, Erin. Hi, Tim.
Tim's been part of ICAN since the start, and ICAN was looking for someone who knew sort of how the landmines process worked and that sort of thing. So I started working a bit with ICAN, and that's how Tim and I met on a crazy few days, having a huge civil society meeting before the diplomatic meeting in Oslo.
Mm-hmm.
It was a pretty exciting moment for our campaign because we had worked for many years to try to convince governments that they needed to start a kind of a diplomatic process to outlaw nuclear weapons. And, it was slow going. And then finally we convinced Norway to take this up, and that conference in Oslo in 2013 was kind of the beginning of the process. It was the first time that countries had actually come together and really discussed in detail what nuclear weapons do when they're used, which is quite an extraordinary thing that it took more than 6 decades after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to have such an intergovernmental conference.
I thought quite refreshing, right?
Yeah, I mean, the dominant approach until recently has been the arms control and non-proliferation approach. So, as you say, it was previously about placing limits on the number of nuclear weapons in deployment, and trying to change the doctrines around when these weapons can be used and when they shouldn't be used, and trying to stop the spread of the weapons to other countries. And we just said, well, why are we having these discussions? What we should be saying is that these weapons are inherently unacceptable given the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of their use. And so the whole humanitarian approach is about delegitimizing and stigmatizing the weapons.
For many years, all you hear about nuclear weapons is, yeah, they're bad, but we need them to be secure. And what the humanitarian approach really did was show you that nuclear weapons aren't making us more secure. They are a massive threat to all of us. I mean, this past few months have taught us what actually makes us secure is, healthcare and food supply and, sanitation and all these things. And nuclear weapons threaten all of those. Mm-hmm. When you debunk that myth that nuclear weapons keep us safe, it really helps move things along. If they're not helping us keep us safe, keep us secure, why are we spending so much money on them? And why are we threatening millions of people's lives?
I'd like to know the history of how this came about so that you actually got listened to and people really took this seriously. It started, I gather, in Australia. Is that right, Tim?
A campaign that started in Melbourne, but we reached out to groups around the world and said, we think it's time to get a treaty negotiated that outlaws nuclear weapons and establishes a framework to eliminate them. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for that idea among groups around the world. We looked at the example of the international campaign to ban landmines. We said, that's the kind of coalition globally that we need for nuclear weapons. At the time, there was also the process underway to outlaw cluster munitions, and that kind of brought together a similar coalition of organisations. So those examples were really useful for us in demonstrating what could and should be achieved in the nuclear weapon field. And of course, there have been groups working on nuclear disarmament for decades, ever since the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, really. There have been people and organisations speaking out against terrific weapons. But what we really wanted to do was bring them together and get them focused on the idea of a treaty-based prohibition. And so we went around the world. We spoke about this idea to anyone who would listen to us. We spoke at parliaments, spent a lot of time building partnerships with governments that we thought could help us take this forward. And we also built a strong relationship with the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, which they've also been speaking out against nuclear weapons since Hiroshima. But I guess it's only in recent years that they've become very active in pursuing nuclear disarmament.
The Landmines Treaty's home here is in Ottawa, and it's something that I think Canadians should be really proud of. Was really remarkable because, like Tim said, the international campaign to ban landmines in a similar way built a global campaign from grassroots, and then built partnerships with states. But for one of the first times, we had this like hard weapons security issue where civil society was in the negotiating room, negotiating the treaty. The ICBL brought the people who were most affected by the weapons into the diplomatic sphere, because those are the true experts. And this is something that I'm so glad that ICAN has done as well, is bringing the people that have been most affected by nuclear weapons use in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also testing, whether it's in Australia or in the United States or in Algeria or in this Kiribati and in the Pacific, bringing that expertise, that real life experience into the negotiating room. It was revolutionary during the Ottawa process, and it was incredibly important as we were negotiating the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Without real life examples of what these weapons do to people and survivors who were taking this huge emotional risk to tell their stories over and over again, it's really hard to, I guess it's much easier to sort of put things aside and count weapons. But when you have the survivor voices in the room telling you what it's like, it's so much harder to just put that aside.
It didn't look like a bunch of diplomats arriving with briefcases. It looked like people arriving in wheelchairs, and you had a kind of initiative, both in the landmines negotiations and in the things that started, at least the Oslo meeting was the first I knew about, the meeting to bring victims and civil society people into the discussions. How many governments were willing and interested?
I think that most governments were very happy to hear from the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and from nuclear test survivors. That was a really new perspective for many of them, and I think it shocked them and really motivated them to do more to eliminate the weapons. But these kind of gatherings have been so different from a lot of the traditional arms control meetings, where it is just a small group of countries like the US and Russia involved in those arms control negotiations, whereas the big difference with this humanitarian approach is that it has brought together the whole world and really given agency to some of the smaller countries, or even some of the larger countries that don't have nuclear weapons and have been kind of sidelined from disarmament negotiations. Every person's security is affected by the existence of these weapons, and so we all have a stake in in eliminating them. The Norwegian government at the time was certainly interested in doing this because there were three big humanitarian conferences. The next one was in Mexico, and the one after that was in Austria. And then there were kind of sign-on statements at the UN and all sorts of initiatives that were about showing the scope and the breadth of support for the initiative.
Costa Rica might have said it best. I cannot remember which meeting this was, but the Costa Rican delegate essentially said that the humanitarian initiative bringing democracy back to nuclear disarmament, because it meant that all states, like Tim said, all states and all people have a stake in this, and they all deserve to have a voice.
Did you have a game plan from the beginning of what had to be accomplished and in what kind of order?
Yeah, you can go into these things with your grand vision, but we did have to adapt it along the way based on what countries were willing to do at what time, and I think that in hindsight maybe it was fine that it was drawn out over a period of 4 years, because it did help to get people used to the idea. And then the Mexico conference, which was the following year, really concluded that prohibition of a weapon, so declaring it illegal under international law, is a necessary step towards eliminating a weapon. You don't get rid of the weapon and then put in place a prohibition. You do the prohibition first to stimulate the progress towards elimination. Mm-hmm. And then I'd say that the third conference, the one in Austria, which was at the end of 2014, really established the idea that there is a legal gap, that the existing non-proliferation treaty from 1968, in combination with the regional nuclear weapon-free zones, are not sufficient. So we need a new kind of comprehensive prohibition on nuclear weapons. And so there was a lot of legal analysis at that meeting, and that concluded with a pledge to work together to stigmatise, prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons. And once we had that pledge, we then moved into an open-ended working group established by the UN. So these humanitarian conferences had been outside the UN. We then kind of brought the process into the UN, and that working group looked a little bit more in detail about what kind of legal instrument might be needed. And that resulted in a commitment to set up a negotiating conference in 2017, and we got a resolution adopted by the General Assembly in 2016 to hold that conference.
How do you get yourself set up with an open-ended working group?
So both the open-ended working group and the negotiating conference came out of resolutions in the General Assembly. So the General Assembly gets split into these 6 committees that each have a different theme, and the one that Tim and I spend a lot of our October in usually is First Committee, which looks at disarmament and security. So states that were sort of leading this process put forward a resolution in the First Committee, and it goes through debate there. Most of the time there was a lot of comments from nuclear-armed states and countries like Canada and Australia who are under the nuclear umbrella about how this was a terrible idea, and the states that are pursuing this obviously don't have security concerns, et cetera, et cetera. This was, democracy coming to nuclear disarmament. So the majority of states wanted this to happen. So they were able to move it through the General Assembly, First Committee, and then through the General Assembly itself. So,
what kinds of obstacles did they try to set up to disrupt your activities?
And I would say that almost all of the countries that we worked with in this process experienced intense pressure at some point, and some of those countries backed off as a result of the pressure. Obviously, Norway early on was a champion of this. We lost Norway's support during the process, partly because there was a change of government from a Labor government to a Conservative government. But I think that the US would have seized upon that opportunity to really ensure that Norway was no longer supportive. We had received some funding from Norway, and other supporters of this process had also received funding. That was a way that they tried to destroy the process by ensuring that funding came to an end. But because we had built such a broad coalition and we weren't just depending on one or two countries, the process was able to move forward despite some challenges that we faced along the way. I think one of the other ways that the US and France in particular and the UK have been very active in undermining this is through their alliance relationships and their relationships with former the countries that they formerly colonised, and even just the idea that you don't have to be explicit in saying that we're going to stop providing aid to you or we're going to reduce your aid. It's just kind of implicit in a lot of the discussions that they have with these countries. When you have a powerful country approaching another country and saying, we don't want you to support this treaty, then they kind of back away in many cases. Sometimes, however, the opposite is true, and they think, well, I don't want to be told what to do by France, or I don't want to be told what to do by the UK, and so let's go ahead. This is a really important thing for us to support. Anyway, that pressure ultimately was unsuccessful because we did get the treaty adopted, and a lot of countries have since signed and ratified it.
Well, of course, living in Canada, the thing that I hear, and you live in Australia, so, but Canada is part of NATO, and the argument is that Canada couldn't sign the treaty because belonging to NATO is incompatible with that. So what is the game plan? Many people will say, of course, this is a whole silly idea. You could get all the other countries to agree that nuclear weapons were bad, but the only countries that count are the ones that actually have them. Therefore, don't waste your effort trying to persuade other people. You got to get those guys on board, and they're not going to do it. So give up, go home. This is, there's certain logic in it, but you didn't buy that logic. How did you stand up against that? And what is your argument? I see Erin almost giggling.
I am giggling because, like you said, we're in Canada, and so I do hear that argument a lot, and I always think it's a little ridiculous because, if you look at any law, it's the same argument of, we outlaw murder, but the murderers aren't going to pay attention to that. Who don't want to murder people are obviously going to abide by it. So if we only made laws based on ones that the people that would violate them will obey, no law.
That's the snappiest, easiest comeback I have seen yet.
So it just
logical answer.
Yeah, it makes no sense to me. But for Canada, you do hear that NATO doesn't allow us to join this. But if you actually look at the North Atlantic Treaty, which is the basis of NATO, there's no mention of nuclear weapons in it.
Well, they have them.
Yeah. But, and so none of the legal basis of NATO is contingent on nuclear weapons. Some of the policies that they've agreed to since then is what keeps the NATO nuclear link there. It's possible to be in NATO and have your own opinions on nuclear weapons. I mean, for example, France is a nuclear armed state who does not take part in any of the nuclear stuff that NATO does. They do their own thing. So Canada can look at this and come up with our own way to be part of NATO and not necessarily part of the nuclear umbrella. We also
the alternative is get out of NATO.
There is that.
I really don't know what public opinion is like on that issue. You know, I haven't seen a poll what most Canadians would say about it. I think most Canadians think that we ought to stay in NATO for I don't know what reason, but there's certainly among peace workers a large contingent of people who say the only solution is just get out of NATO. What do you say about that, Erin? And do you think it's something that people in ICAN have to take a position on?
I don't take a position on whether Canada should be in NATO or out of NATO. I'm very practical when it comes to my campaigning in Canada. You say get out of NATO, that's going to rankle people. It's going to make things more complicated. What I'm saying right now is that Canada needs to actually study the treaty and how it fits into all of our different agreements. We've never seen a public study. There's never been any parliamentary review of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. You hear one lines of Canada that's incompatible with NATO, but I haven't seen any of Canada's work to show that where they got that conclusion from. Who have they talked to in Canada? Which decision makers? Which academics? Which experts? Where are they getting their legal analysis? Canada needs to do the work. If the government of Canada wants to say that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is incompatible with Canada's security, they need to show the work. Mm-hmm. And they've never done that work. So this sort of government writing off the treaty that they've done so far is just really poor policy. Mm-hmm. So first things first, Canada needs to look at the treaty and study it in depth. And in the meantime, there's a lot of smaller steps within the treaty that Canada should be supporting. I mean, Tim and I worked quite closely on some of the language around recognizing Indigenous rights and that Indigenous people have been disproportionately impacted by nuclear weapons. Canada wants to pursue reconciliation on a national level. That's something we need to look at.
Yeah, okay. I haven't really heard people making that argument. In what way I can guess the answer, but I think I'd like for you to say it. How come, and in what sense, have Indigenous people been disproportionately affected by nuclear weapons?
Well, I'll talk about North America, and then Tim, I think, can talk a little bit more about Australia on this one. But in general, anywhere nuclear weapons have been tested, it's been on Indigenous land. So whether it's the British or the French in the South Pacific, or in Australia, the Americans in Nevada and sort of the Southwest, the Russians in the North, French in Algeria. When countries test nuclear weapons, they tend to test it on Indigenous land with very little regard for the people that have been living there before, their culture, their way of life, and their connection to the land. Mm-hmm. But okay. Tim does a lot more work on this area.
I'd like to hear about the Australians. I guess there was testing in Australia at some point, wasn't there, Tim?
Yeah, there was British nuclear testing in Australia in the 1950s and 60s, and that was conducted on Aboriginal land where the government of the day, both the British government and the Australian government said that there were no Aboriginal people living in the vicinity of the tests, but that was proven to be wrong, and there were a lot of people who were exposed to high levels of radiation as a result of those tests. Not only the full-scale atmospheric tests, but also what were termed minor trials, where they were conducting all sorts of experiments that left a very toxic legacy. And large areas of land are still contaminated as a result of the tests, and Aboriginal people have been disconnected from that land and from their traditional way of life as a result. And through this humanitarian process, we've tried to draw attention to that. We also shouldn't ignore the fact that other aspects of nuclear weapons production have also disproportionately affected Indigenous peoples. In Australia, a lot of the uranium that has been used in British nuclear weapons as well as American nuclear weapons has come from our land. Of course, there are safeguards in place now that are designed to try to stop our uranium being used in weapons, but historically that was certainly the case, and the uranium mining has also caused huge problems in terms of displacing communities and contaminating waterways and so on.
Okay, let's talk about not only the present but the future. You've got a treaty. You've got quite a few countries have not only signed it but ratified it. Give us some numbers. How does that stand now? The process, you need 50 countries to have ratified the treaty before it comes into effect, right? So
That's
how are
right.
we doing?
Yeah, so we're currently at 39 ratifications, expecting the 40th in the coming days, and we have 81 signatures. So the signature is a kind of a symbolic commitment to the treaty, and the ratification is a very formal legal commitment where the country actually becomes legally bound. And that ratification process is often quite lengthy, involving all government agencies, and usually the Parliament will be required to vote on the ratification and sometimes introduce domestic legislation to ensure that all of the obligations under the treaty are incorporated into domestic law.
Now, what's going to happen when you get 50? What is the legal use? It comes into effect, but what actual difference is there in the status of international law the minute you have these 50 ratifications? What difference does it make in the world?
Well, I think that it will be harder for nuclear armed states to ignore. It'll be harder for financial institutions around the world to ignore a treaty that is actually in legal force. It's only binding on the countries that have ratified it. So it'll enter into force 90 days after we hit 50 ratifications. But the treaty will establish a strong international norm, and this is the best that we have, because we can't force nuclear armed states to disarm. We're not advocating that that we have other countries go into those countries against their will and forcibly disarm them. And so the most that we have can be international pressure through international legal norms and domestic citizen action in those nuclear armed states. So I don't think that entry into force is going to fundamentally change things immediately, but I think that over time, as more and more countries join this important international legal instrument, it will have a powerful impact on the behaviour of countries that possess the weapons. And we've seen this with the landmine treaty, with the cluster munitions treaty. You don't have to be a party to the treaty in order for it to have an effect on the way that you operate. There have been cluster munition producers in the US, for example, where they're not legally bound to the prohibitions in that treaty, but they've said, well, there's no market for these weapons anymore. These weapons have been stigmatised and prohibited under international law, and so we're not going to produce them anymore. And I hope that we have similar effects with the nuclear weapon ban treaty.
Yeah, and there are some what we call positive obligations in the treaty surrounding assistance to victims of nuclear weapons use and testing, and environmental remediation, as well as obligations to help affected states that are affected by use and testing to meet those obligations. So that's one way that when the treaty enters into force, it becomes a new tool for survivors, victims, and their communities to advocate for their rights and to ensure that they're getting the support they need.
Mm-hmm. I didn't know that. So the victims get a little more leverage. You need a hell of a lot more leverage, though. When I look at the trends, for one thing, you talk about the landmines. I believe that Trump has said they're not even going to go along with this self-restraint. I think the U.S. had actually, without signing the landmines treaty, had been in effect going along with it. But that's not going to be the case anymore. Is that right?
That is correct. However, the amount of outrage from other branches of the American government on that, so Congress is not on board with this. So I don't think that change is going to last beyond this current presidency. Yeah. But like Tim said, the reason that there was so much pushback domestically when that announcement came out was because of the stigma on the weapons. So that's what we're really hoping to see once the treaty enters into force.
Now that's really the only leverage that I hear people counting on. I mean, I don't know, maybe there are other levers that I'm not aware of, economic or something. Somehow the international legal system, I suppose, the courts might do something more than they've done. But mostly you're talking about making people ashamed of what their country is doing. Well, how, that and $1.50 can get you a cup of coffee, to be cynical.
Just to pick up on the economic levers, we've got a big campaign in place called Don't Bank on the Bomb, which is about getting financial institutions around the world to divest from nuclear weapon companies. And that campaign has identified, I think, about 30 companies that have a major role in producing and maintaining nuclear weapons, principally for the US, UK, and France.
Now, wait a minute. Let's check that. That's really good, because is ICAN behind that? I mean, did you start it or somebody else start it? Because it's a great idea, but it's really planned to try to put pressure on corporations, right? More than the government itself. It's not so much that a political measure as it is hoping that investors will take their money out of companies that manufacture weapons. Am I wrong?
Yeah, that's right. So even if the government is unwilling to support the treaty and is very supportive of nuclear weapons, we think that there could be financial institutions in that country that are willing to take a step against nuclear weapons by divesting. Don't Bank on the Bomb is something that ICAN started in 2012, I think it was. And each year, our partner organisation, Pax Christi in the Netherlands, has produced an update of the annual of the report with new statistics on which financial institutions are divesting. So we're talking about banks and pension funds and other institutions that have shareholdings, that are providing loans, and a lot of them are now adopting policies saying that we won't do that. And I think that the treaty has really helped to make them take this more seriously. We know that a lot of companies previously had policies in place not to invest in what they call controversial weapons. And we asked them, what's a controversial weapon? And a lot of them said, well, they're the weapons that have been prohibited under international law. And so they pointed to, landmines and cluster munitions and chemical weapons and so on. And we said, well, surely nuclear weapons are controversial weapons. These are the weapons with by far the greatest destructive potential. And they said, well, where's the treaty? And so being able to say this treaty has been adopted, we're now expecting it to enter into force in the near future, you need to update your policy to make sure that nuclear weapons are covered.
Mm-hmm.
And it does have an impact on governments as well, when nuclear weapons are big money. So when you're starting to dry up the supply, it makes it harder to modernize or build more. So it does, what we're seeing with cluster munitions is that as the producers get out of the business, it gets harder and harder for the countries that want to hold on to their cluster munitions to be able to do it. So it's just another sort of angle to get at eventual elimination.
I've never owned a nuclear weapon, so I'm trying to imagine how it comes into existence and how much the government is the producer as opposed to a company. I mean, the whole thing isn't done by private industry, is it? And most of these plants where they manufacture the bombs must be government property and funded by taxpayers rather than by corporations. Or am I wrong?
A lot of the work is done by corporations. I think that in some countries the work on the warhead is done exclusively by the government, but a lot of the related work is on the missiles and delivery systems is done by private contractors, and I think it's primarily the three countries that I mentioned, the UK, the US, and France, that have a large number of corporations heavily involved in the nuclear weapons, in their nuclear weapons programs.
So US and Russia and China, let's say, I'm guessing, they are most of the components would have been manufactured on government property by government employees, etc., or not?
Not necessarily for the US. When we're not sure necessarily when it comes to Russia and China, because, they're less transparent, and also weapons companies in those countries are not publicly traded. So a lot of the data that we get for Don't Bank on the Bomb, the companies have to be publicly traded for them to show up in this report, which is designed as a tool for citizens to be able to go to your bank. So in Canada, there's a whole list of Canadian banks that are loaning money or investing in companies that are involved in nuclear weapons production. So you can go to don'tbankonthebomb.com, look up your own bank. And then you can, next time you're in the bank or calling them, next time they call to check on your service, you can actually point out to them that you don't want your money being used for this purpose. They need to update their policies. So it's a tool for us on an individual level, even if we don't live in a country that makes nuclear weapons, to help with that.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to countries that are nuclear weapons producers, it's still their tax dollars that are going to these private companies. So they have both the ability to go and try and pull their money out of the financial sector, as well as lobby their local representatives to try and reduce the amount of tax dollars that are going to nuclear weapons.
Okay, in terms of political pressure, when you say you're going to apply, you're going to shame these people, well, some politicians are pretty shameless, I mean, I think the most distinctive characteristic of Trump's personality is that this man cannot be shamed. There's nothing that would make him acknowledge that he's done something, embarrassing. If you catch him in some flagrant act, he will just brag about it. So clearly, not all politicians are very susceptible to being influenced by that kind of opprobrium. But I wonder just how far you can, or how you can organize a campaign to apply shame. What do you do? Well, let's say if there's a convention for in the U.S. this year, which I guess there will be some kind of convention, but I don't even know whether they'll be meeting in person or not. But that would be a good place to try to have some influence on a political party. As far as I know, though, there's not much daylight between the policies of the Democrats and Republicans right now when it comes to funding nuclear modernization and so on. And certainly the Liberal Party in Canada has been a big disappointment. I don't have any hope for Russia. When I call people in Russia to try to talk to nuclear weapons experts, the most I can get would be somebody like Alexei Arbatov, who's probably the most knowledgeable and progressive and concerned expert about nuclear weapons in Russia. But the most he will do is talk about the importance of restarting arms control negotiations. Sorry, but that's not where I think we should even pay any attention. I think, well, of course you do. You want to keep the New START and so on, but the future really depends on disarmament, not arms control or limitations. And I haven't talked to any Russians who sound as if there's any support, whatever, anywhere near government for real disarmament. In fact, I don't even know whether it's safe for a Russian to be talking that way, given the new constitutional changes in Russia today. So I'm trying to mull over the prospects for having internal political pressure that would make a difference in any of the nuclear weapons states. And frankly, it doesn't look very promising to me. Can you please help me change my mind?
I'll give it a try, and then I'll turn it over to Tim, because he's one of the most successful parliamentary campaigners I think ICAN has. But I think, when you're talking about shame, that's probably on a parliamentary outreach, person-to-person level. It's not necessarily probably where I would go. Whenever I'm training new campaigners on how to do this sort of work, I always tell people that, campaigning and lobbying and stuff is literally just retail, only instead of selling shoes or a dress or whatever, you're selling a policy position. So you need to look at the person you're talking to, figure out why they're in the store or what their thing is and tailor your arguments to that. So shaming Trump, you're right, would not work. Talking about how nuclear weapons are a really bad deal would probably be a better argument for him. That, you look weak if you're relying on these big weapons. You need, look at how much money you're spending on this. Like, only a fool would spend that much money on something you can't actually use without killing yourself. Something like that. And right now, because of the pandemic, I think some of the work that ICAN's been doing on how much money is being used for nuclear weapons and how many ICU beds that can buy, and how many nurses that can pay for, and how many doctors that can pay for it. That could work really well with some decision makers in France, in the UK, and even in the US. So I think there is room for movement. You just have to figure out how to empower the person that can make the decisions. In Canada, it's going to be a lot of courage that people need. We know what the right thing to do is. Canada's been very close to being a leader on nuclear disarmament in the past. So it's just a matter of telling those in government that they can do this. Sure, they're going to get some blowback, but you know what? It's going to be really good for them. Look at how amazing you'll be able to change the world, like that sort of language. But Tim, I'll turn it over to you because I am usually in awe of your parliamentary campaigning and all your work with ratifications. So you probably have more inspirational things to say.
Don't know about that. It's it's pretty depressing when you look at the US and Donald Trump and all of the damage that he's caused to the arms control regime. And sure, we can say that arms control is inadequate and not the approach that we should be focusing on. But at the same time, it has been very useful in at least placing some limits on these worst weapons of mass destruction. So to see that kind of eroded or torn apart in the way that is done is really frightening. And I think there's still a widespread belief in the US that nuclear weapons are acceptable weapons, that Hiroshima and Nagasaki saved millions of American lives and therefore were justified. All of this kind of unwillingness to accept the atrocities of the past and this kind of belief in the myths that were propagated after World War II is still part of the problem of why we have thousands of these weapons in the world.
Have you ever seen anybody change their mind right in front of your eyes and decide that they are on your side?
Not so often, but what we do see is that people who are skeptical about the merits of a particular initiative or who don't feel particularly strongly about an issue can change their mind if they hear the arguments. And I think also once a politician sees which other politicians are supporting something or which other countries are supporting something, it can kind of have a cascading effect. And with the treaty, when we've been able to say, look, this country has just ratified, will you ratify? And they're like, and then we'll hear countries say, oh, well, if they're on board, we're on board. And so there is a kind of a group mentality, a sense of wanting to be on the right side with the right team, with the good guys, not the bad guys, in pushing this, in moving ahead with this. So I've certainly seen the way that can change the thinking of politicians and decision makers.
if one of the NATO countries changed and decided to sign a treaty, for example, would that have any impact on the nation, on the nuclear, states, U.S. and UK?
It's interesting because the US actually sent around a paper to its allies just before the negotiation of the treaty. In fact, it was just before the General Assembly adopted the mandate for the negotiations. So this was not under the Trump administration. This was late in 2016 under the Obama administration. And they said this proposed treaty that Mexico and Austria and others are trying to get negotiated is very dangerous, because if our allies in NATO join it, it will make it harder for us to do everything that we need to do with our nuclear weapons. It'll impose all kinds of constraints on our nuclear warfighting ability. And so they were very explicit about that, and really, in a strange way, spelled out more clearly than we had the rationale for this treaty to bring about real change. If countries like Canada and other NATO allies were willing to get on board. And I think that we will have NATO countries join, and once one country is willing to break from the pack, others will follow. Maybe the Liberals in Canada are too gutless to do it, but I think that there are leaders in Germany and other European countries that are seriously thinking about this. Just earlier this year, there was a resolution in the Belgian Parliament, which was only narrowly defeated, and that was to remove the US nuclear weapons from Belgium and join the nuclear weapon ban treaty. And that really scared some of those in NATO countries that are trying to preserve the status quo, because they can see.
NATO's based in Belgium. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that would it would have quite an effect. And in Germany now, we've got some very prominent politicians who could be in a very powerful position after the elections next year, saying that they want US nuclear weapons removed, and declaring their support also for the treaty. So I think it's only a matter of time, and it's a pity that Canada hasn't yet shown more support.
I've only seen that international polls that are maybe 10 years old at least, but all of them. I think I once made a table listing all the polls that I could find where they'd ask people, the population, if they wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons, abolish them. And I think every country except Pakistan in one poll and Israel in another, the majority of the population would say yes, they want to abolish nuclear weapons. That, of course, included the U.S. In Canada, it was, oh my God, I've forgotten the numbers, but we're talking not just bare minimum majorities, but 70-80% majorities in most countries. So if most people want to get rid of nuclear weapons and they live in a democracy, why aren't they gone? Why is it so hard to get? I mean, it's like asking a hypothetical question. Would you like pie in the sky? I think people would just say, yeah, it'd be nice if we could get rid of nuclear weapons, and I wish they would. But in terms of really thinking, yeah, this is something we should demand and organize, and it should be a major part of our, planks of our platform of whatever party I'm in. They don't seem to do that. What will it take to make that happen?
I had hoped that the election of Donald Trump might prompt some of the leaders of other NATO countries to take a more independent position on nuclear weapons and a range of other issues. I guess there's a nice analogy to be made with Martin Luther King's concept of the white moderates being the kind of the main problem, in the sense that there are people who are more concerned about maintaining order and not creating any kind of problems than they are about achieving justice. And I think that's the problem that we face in Australia and Canada and elsewhere. There's general support for disarmament, sure, but the people in leadership are so worried about upsetting the US that they just go along with these outrageous policies and continue to support these horrific weapons for fear of ruffling some feathers. Sure, there are going to be some negative reactions if Canada were to join this treaty, but overwhelmingly the reaction will be positive, I think, from the Canadian people, from the international community, and sometimes you've got to take bold moves for the sake of doing what's right.
Mm-hmm. Erin, do you have any see any hopeful signs?
To be honest, I do. Kim is right to be disappointed that the election of someone who is clearly quite unstable to have sole authority over an entire country's nuclear arsenal should have had a bit more of an impact, I think, for a lot of people than it has. But I do have hope, because we're seeing right now these large-scale global movements trying to seek out more justice and right global wrongs. So whether you're looking at the school strikes for climate, whether you're looking at Black Lives Matter, we're seeing these existential threats to us, whether it's climate or inequality, being really harshly challenged.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing that it's possible to have regular people, ordinary people, speak up, take down these big myths that we've been living with for years. The myth that, industry is going to be what saves us. We have to like fossil fuels, we must have. Oil and gas is what makes us money. Those myths of, there's no racism in Canada. After the civil rights movement, everything's fine. Everyone's treated equally. These myths that a lot of our society is built on are being challenged right now. And it's only a matter of time before the myth that nuclear weapons keep us safe, before we are able to challenge that on a mass scale.
Mm-hmm.
ICAN has done a fantastic job. The TPNW has done this great job of laying the framework that is a myth. They don't actually keep us safe. This is just a story we're telling ourselves. So now we're just a couple steps away from that, going from a story a failed story to what's next and taking action. That is what's going to take down nuclear weapons. And that's what's going to get the NATO states eventually to fall in line under the treaty. And then it's going to be harder and harder for the nuclear armed states to maintain the story that they're telling themselves, that they need this to be secure.
But I see an effort now to start up again and knit people together and create a global movement. And to me, that's really going to be what's necessary. You folks have paved the way. ICAN is certainly the most hopeful sign that any of us have experienced when I guess since, when Gorbachev and Reagan were in Iceland, that was the closest to the time we might have made it to a real disarmament. And since then, it's been downhill almost the whole way with bumps, ups and downs. But now it looks pretty good, like something might happen, that public opinion might again switch in the direction that we need it to go. And you have made that possible. So I really want to thank you for the huge contribution you've made, both of you. And
thank you. That's really nice. And I think that if we're going to see real change, we do need to be focusing on public opinion and multilateral approaches with grounded in international law, and not just kind of look to one or two leaders who might have some nice ideas and make some nice statements. I'm kind of alluding here to President Obama and that kind of period of hope around nuclear disarmament, because he gave his famous speech in Prague in 2009 that won him got him a Nobel Peace Prize, and I think that's not how we're going to change things. That we do need this kind of global grassroots movement.
I thank you for everything you've done, and I want to play on your team. So good wishes for us all.
Lovely to talk.
Okay.
Thanks, Metta, and thanks for letting me see Tim for the first time in months.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.